If you've ever felt the hush in a valley at night, as though the wind itself was holding its breath, then you already know how stories like this begin. And if you're brave enough to stay, I'll tell you one of the strangest true horror stories. Few dare to whisper the arrival of Reverend Corbin Yates in a place they would soon call the Mouth. In the spring of 1847, the villagers of Hollow Glen looked out across salted ridges and swaying black pines, and saw a man walking alone where no man should have survived, barefoot over snowmelt and thorn, carrying nothing but a leather-bound Bible and a satchel that clinked like teeth rattling in a glass. He wore no hat, no gloves, and his eyes shone too pale for any mortal priest. The locals would swear for generations that he came not from the roads, but from the shadows themselves, stepping through wind that smelled faintly of vinegar and secrets. He gave no name beyond Reverend Yates, and when asked why he traveled alone past lands haunted by wolves, storms, and things older than weather, he answered simply, "The valley called me," and so he stayed. By midsummer, he built a structure at the valley's heart from cedar beams dragged from the ruins of a tannery and plaster mixed with ash scraped from abandoned smokehouses, naming it the Temple of the Vine. It bore no bell, no cross, no steeple, only an open basin at its altar, into which no water was ever poured, only vinegar dark as old blood. Those who dared approach claimed the place felt alive, as if the wood itself was listening, and in the corners of the valley, hunters began to speak of a presence coiling through the pines. This is a tale of unexplained rituals, haunted places, and forbidden knowledge, a chilling descent into a cult so secret, even its own faithful whispered rather than prayed. And the strangest part, it all started with one man who said the valley was calling his name. They called it the Temple of the Vine, though there were those who said it was no temple at all, merely a husk built to cradle something that wanted worship far older than any god. It stood in the center of Hollow Glen, like a wound carved into the earth, its walls raised from old cedar beams blackened by weather and time, each plank soaked in the scent of tannin and ancient fires. The villagers said you could press your ear against the cedar and hear the faint sound of breathing, as though the timber still remembered the tannery from which it had been stolen. Or perhaps something deeper still, the ghost of salt, the hiss of steam, the hush of flesh being stripped from bone. The plaster between the boards bore streaks of gray and white, a swirling pattern no one could scrub clean, mixed from ash scraped off the walls of derelict smokehouses where no embers had burned in decades. There was no bell hung above its roof, no steeple pointing skyward, no cross to bless the front threshold. Instead, there stood an open basin at the sanctuary's heart, cut from dark stone and ringed with shallow carvings of twisting vines and bulbous fruit that seemed on the brink of rot. Into this basin, Reverend Yates poured not holy water but vinegar as dark as old wine, thick and sharp enough to sting the eyes. He said nothing at first of why the basin must never remain dry. He only whispered, "Memory must sour before it sweetens," a phrase that would become the first of many punchlines to echo across the valley, repeated by farmers, whispered by widows, scratched into lintels above doorways, as if every household wished to prove it, again and again, that what they believed was not merely superstition, but a truth that could curdle the spirit if left untold. Some in Hollow Glen claimed that the basin wept on cold mornings, releasing a fine mist that curled along the chapel floor like a living thing, tasting the air for secrets. Others believed the vinegar drew whispers from the walls, words you could almost hear if you held your breath and closed your eyes. And for those who dared approach too close, there was always the smell, a scent between sweetness and bile, something that conjured old cellars, locked rooms, and memories half forgotten but never quite gone. The first to gather around the Temple of the Vine came not from distant cities but from 30 miles or less, drawn by rumors that slithered through pine hollows and down salted ridges, talk of a man who had crossed the wilderness barefoot, who spoke softly enough to bend the wind, who built a house for vinegar instead of worship. They came in twos and threes, farmhands in wrong-side-out coats, widows carrying small jars of brined fruit, and a few whose eyes held the hollow shine of souls once tethered to other, quieter chapels. And though no sign was posted on the road, though no summons was sent by letter or word of mouth, they arrived at dusk with lanterns shielded against the breeze, stepping inside a sanctuary that felt less like salvation and more like a place where the bones of the valley came to confess. No laughter echoed between those walls. No hymns rose in song. Instead, they moved like shadows, laying offerings at the basin's lip curls of salted pork. Dried cherries steeped in vinegar spiced with rosemary. Sprigs of herbs wrapped in thread dyed the color of blood. No rules were written, yet all seemed to know the cost of noise, the weight of sweetness. Reverend Yates spoke of decay as though it were the truest scripture, teaching that the soul only ripens once the body begins to fail. That rot reveals what purity tries to hide. Infants were not baptized but given bitter draughts that puckered their tiny mouths. The dead were not sealed away in boxes of pine or oak, but wound tight in linen and steeped in vinegar until their scent became something sharp enough to chase away grief. Sermons began at dusk and ended before the crows could stir. Yet no one ever recalled hearing Yates shout. He whispered, and somehow his voice carried, even through stone and rain and wind. There were those who stood outside the temple, frozen beneath frost-heavy branches, who insisted the words found them anyway, as if the valley itself spoke in tandem with the Reverend's breath. One man, his face lost behind a beard thick as moss, claimed that on his first night at the temple, he heard a voice rise from the vinegar basin that was not Yates's at all. It spoke in a tongue he could not name and ended in a soft laugh that left his spine cold for days. And from that night forward, he wore a strip of salt-soaked linen tied around his throat, muttering that vinegar remembers everything it has touched. Word spread beyond Hollow Glen, carried by peddlers, traders, and wandering woodsmen who whispered of a church with no cross. A congregation that feared bread unless it had first grown hard and gray. They spoke of rituals that reeked of mildew and bitter wine, of prayers recited into vinegar jars and sealed with wax as though words themselves might sour if left too long in open air. And so the legend of the Temple of the Vine began to bleed outward, turning Hollow Glen from a name on a county map into something else, a phrase spoken low in taverns, a warning for those who dared hunt too far north. "Don't follow the lantern light," men would murmur, knuckles tight around glass mugs. "Not unless you want to find the place where vinegar breathes." Punchline after punchline grew from the soil of Hollow Glen, dark seeds sprouting into rumors, each tale more tangled than the last. They said Reverend Yates never blinked when he preached, that the basin in the temple grew deeper each week, swallowing secrets until the bottom fell away into darkness. They said the vinegar itself learned to speak, reciting the names of the dead to anyone who lingered past the final prayer. And always, they repeated Yates's first words to the valley. "The valley called me." It became a phrase soaked in dread, a line that felt less like an explanation and more like an invitation. Because if a valley can call one man, who's to say it won't call you next? And who's to say what will answer when you call back in a world obsessed with true horror stories? Haunted places, secret cults, and forbidden knowledge. The Temple of the Vine stands as one of the strangest unsolved mysteries ever whispered through the pines, a folk horror so potent it feels like vinegar biting the back of your throat. This is not merely a story, it's a warning what was poured into that basin might still be listening. They came because something shifted in the wind, because silence fell over the pines and stayed there like a held breath. Because in Hollow Glen, the night began to feel thicker than mere darkness. There were no posters nailed to trees, no belfry tolling summons. Yet by midsummer, the valley began swallowing strangers whole. They arrived under skies veined with pale lightning, following dirt paths that twisted as though guiding them, carrying lanterns shrouded in cloth to keep the flames soft and secret. They were farmhands whose boots still held red clay, widows with trembling fingers wrapped tight around the handles of wicker baskets, woodsmen who smelled of pitch and fear, and traders whose coats bore the scent of distant roads and salt. Each one bore something small and precious: slabs of salt pork wrapped in linen, shriveled berries steeped in dark vinegar, curls of dried herbs tied in crimson thread. None could say who first suggested bringing offerings. It was as if the idea bloomed in every mind at once, like mold blooming on cellar stones. No one admitted why they came. and yet all seemed certain that the valley itself had whispered an invitation none dared refuse. Some said the ground hummed underfoot, thrumming like the skin of a drum. Others claimed the air grew cold, even when the sun hung bright above the ridgelines, as if the shadows were crawling closer with unseen fingers. And so, driven by curiosity or dread, or a desire to see what lay behind the rumors, they gathered before the Temple of the Vine, which rose from the earth like the spine of some buried beast. Its cedar beams still reeked of tannin and forgotten fires, and though wind passed through its gaps, the interior seemed always too still, as if breath itself dared not stir the gloom. The congregation slipped inside one by one, and as the threshold swallowed them, it felt as though time itself was kneeling in reverence. No bells rang overhead. No cross adorned the entrance. Instead, all eyes fell upon the basin that sat like a wound carved into the center of the floor, its stone sides etched with twisting vines and strange fruit swollen almost to bursting. Into that basin, Reverend Yates poured vinegar so dark it reflected no lamplight, vinegar whose scent coiled through the chapel, sharp and sweet like spoiled wine and old secrets. And though he stood with shoulders bowed, though he spoke in a voice no louder than a breath, his words struck the crowd as though shouted from the ridges. Memory must sour before it sweetens. That single sentence wrapped itself around every heart, squeezing until pulse and thought moved as one. It became the first true punchline of Hollow Glen, a phrase that lingered in the marrow long after voices fell silent. People repeated it under their breath in fields, etched it into the beams of their barns, whispered it into glass jars of vinegar before sealing them tight with wax. They said it was not merely a saying, it was a warning. Because in Hollow Glen, what sweetened was never just memory. It was something waiting to be fed. In those first nights, the congregation learned rules that no scripture wrote down. There was to be no laughter beneath the cedar rafters, no singing to pierce the hush, no bread consumed unless left to harden into stone. Every breath seemed a trespass. Every footstep echoed like the slam of a cell door. Some claimed the basin's surface rippled when Yates paused, as though it drank his silence and exhaled secrets back into the room. Others whispered that if you gazed too long into the vinegar, you'd see faces staring up from beneath the blackness, mouthing words you'd once said and wished you'd forgotten. Time felt stranger inside the temple. Hours stretched and buckled. Shadows curved at odd angles. A woman once swore that the grain of the cedar planks shifted under her palm, forming letters that spelled her childhood name. A man confessed that he blinked and found himself standing in a different pew, with dust thick on his shoulders as if he'd been waiting there for years. Outside, wind carried rumors faster than any wagon. Traders and hunters spoke in low voices about Hollow Glen's dark history, about a man who arrived barefoot, about a place where vinegar hissed as though alive. They called it one of the strangest true horror stories ever whispered, an unsolved mystery hidden in the folds of forgotten maps. They said there was no organ music in the Temple of the Vine, only silence, and the faint hiss of vinegar creeping over stone. And in the silence, the congregation began to suspect that this was not merely a place of worship. It was an altar built to feed something waiting beneath the valley floor. Something that remembered the taste of every secret ever uttered. From the basin came a scent that curled around ribs and settled in the back of the throat, a smell that hinted at pickled fruit and old cellars. But beneath it all, a reek, like the inside of a locked room long sealed from daylight. Yates never explained why the basin must never be empty. He only watched the liquid swirl, then lifted his eyes and murmured words that felt older than any church. Some truths were born bitter. That became another punchline, another echo, another nail in the coffin of certainty. The people of Hollow Glen began to wonder if the temple was listening. If the basin heard confessions no lips dared speak. And if so, what price might the valley demand in exchange for silence? Because the longer they stood beneath the cedar beams, the more they felt the valley leaning closer, as though waiting to hear its own name spoken aloud. And in that hush, a single question grew roots in every mind. If Reverend Yates could hear the valley's call, who else might it be calling? And worse still, what if the valley was listening back? As summer drew deeper into the bones of the valley, something strange began to happen around the Temple of the Vine. People who had once counted the days by sunrise and harvest now began measuring time by the hush that settled over Hallowed Glen each evening. And though the congregation never numbered more than a few dozen souls, it felt as if the entire valley leaned closer each time Reverend Yates took his place behind the basin. There was no choir, no rustle of hymnals opening in unison, only a silence so absolute that every breath seemed loud enough to shatter glass. Within that hush, a new ritual began to emerge, not written in any scripture, nor spoken aloud, yet obeyed with a fervor deeper than faith. They called it the Vigil of the Vine. In those early gatherings, the faithful arrived with offerings, each one shaped by a private fear or hope. Salt pork for protection, dried fruit for remembrance, vinegar infused with rosemary for secrets best kept. But soon, the offerings became stranger. One woman placed a lock of her own hair into the basin, whispering that memory lived in every strand. Another man poured in a vial of rainwater collected during a storm that he claimed had spoken his name. The basin swallowed it all without protest, dark liquid lapping once around the stone rim before settling into stillness so perfect it seemed to swallow sound. People began to believe that the vinegar itself was listening, and that belief carried a sharp edge, like a blade hidden beneath velvet. It was said that the basin could remember every sorrow poured into it, and that it might speak those sorrows back when least expected. One farmer, gaunt and hollow-eyed, claimed he saw the face of his dead brother ripple across the surface, mouthing words he hadn't spoken in life. Another swore he heard laughter rise from the vinegar, laughter that matched no human voice. Punchlines began to blossom like rot beneath floorboards. In Hallowed Glen, nothing stays buried, or vinegar keeps secrets better than soil ever could. People repeated these lines as though reciting prayers, half in jest, half in mortal dread. Some scratched them into barn doors. Others whispered them into vinegar jars before sealing them with wax, convinced that the act might keep unwanted memories from spilling into their dreams. The Temple of the Vine became a place where reality itself seemed thin, as if one might step through a crack between the cedar beams and find a different world waiting on the other side. The congregants grew accustomed to moments where time seemed to stall mid-breath. A woman might blink and find herself standing closer to the basin than she remembered. A man might turn his head and discover a new face beside him, eyes dark and depthless, watching with an intensity that felt less human than mineral. No one ever spoke of these moments directly, but an unspoken question pulsed beneath every glance. Were they all witnessing the same unraveling, or had the temple begun dividing their memories, portioning out different pieces of truth to each of them? That was the creeping terror of Hallowed Glen, that reality might not be shared, but dealt out in fragments, like cards from a deck that shuffled itself in the dark. Outside the temple, the village began to change in ways subtle and strange. Mirrors disappeared from walls, as if the people feared catching sight of something standing behind their own reflections. Buckets of water were boiled and left to cool beside thresholds. To catch memory, they said, as though memory were a moth that might drown itself in any still pool. No one sang, not even lullabies for children. Instead, families whispered psalms into vinegar jars, sealing them tight, burying them beneath floorboards, as if sound itself might become dangerous if left to echo freely. The lines between the congregation and the rest of Hallowed Glen blurred, until it seemed every house in the valley was bound to the temple by invisible threads of ritual and dread. Word began to seep beyond the forest, carried by traders who stopped at Hallowed Glen's edge but refused to enter. They spoke of a church without a cross, a preacher who arrived barefoot from nowhere, and a congregation terrified of bread unless it had gone stale. They said the valley smelled of vinegar and secrets, and that the wind there sometimes whispered back when spoken to. And always, they ended with the same punchline, like a curse disguised as humor. Even vinegar needs time to steep. As rumors spread, so too did the unease. Travelers began to avoid the old roads near Hallowed Glen, saying that maps seemed to warp around the valley, bending routes that had been straight for generations. Compass needles spun lazily, pointing not north, but inward, toward the heart of the temple. And those who ventured too close claimed to feel a weight pressing on their lungs, as though the very air resisted being breathed. Within Hollow Glen, suspicion grew like mold on wet beams. People began watching one another with sidelong glances, searching for signs that someone might be different. More than one man woke in the night to find his wife standing beside the bed, eyes wide, lips moving silently, as if reciting some hidden prayer. And when questioned, she'd swear she'd never left her dreams. In the taverns, those who dared speak of the temple lowered their voices and confessed that sometimes, when the wind shifted, they smelled vinegar in places it shouldn't be in their hair, beneath their fingernails, in the folds of their clothes. And once smelled, it lingered, clinging to memory the way smoke clings to old draperies. People began to wonder, had the temple been built merely as a place of worship, or was it a threshold? A door to something waiting beneath the valley floor. A place where reality itself might bend, letting through things too bitter to exist in daylight. And if that door had opened for Reverend Yates, how long before it opened for them all? By the first frost of 1848. Hollow Glen had begun to shift in ways that left even the most faithful uneasy, as though a great animal was turning beneath the soil, testing the strength of the earth that held it. What began as whispers around the basin had now blossomed into something larger, something visible in the eyes of the people and audible in the hush that fell over the valley each dusk. More bodies began arriving at the Temple of the Vine, not merely those claimed by age or illness, but by accidents, by drownings, by fevers that seemed to know precisely whose breath to snatch away. And though no one spoke the words outright, there hung over every gathering the grim hope that the dead might not be lost, not permanently, not if brought swiftly to Reverend Yates and laid beneath his watchful eyes. So the vine cellar filled, rows upon rows of linen-wrapped figures steeped in vinegar, their contours slowly blurring until it became difficult to tell where flesh ended and the cloth began. And above it all drifted that smell, part sharpness, part rot, a smell that clung to hair and clothing, and seemed to crawl into the back of the throat, leaving the taste of metal and secrets. It was said that once a person was laid in the cellar, their family no longer mourned in the old ways. Instead, they gathered in silence, not to pray for peace, but to wait for movement, for a flutter of fingers or the opening of eyes. They did not want closure. They wanted return. Because in Hollow Glen, the line between life and death had begun to smear like ink dropped into water. A woman named Miriam Lothrop was one of the first whose return sowed doubt rather than comfort. She had died of lockjaw, her body twisted in rigid agony, jaw clenched so tight her brother Dee had wept trying to pry her teeth apart. But Dee claimed she had spoken to him from the smokehouse where her body lay, telling him to fetch the old vinegar from their father's cider barrels. And so, trembling, he brought her to the vine cellar, laid her beneath the center beam, and poured the vinegar over her linen-shrouded form. For 3 days, nothing stirred. On the 4th, moaning began low, guttural sounds that seemed less voice than something scraping stone. On the 5th, her fingers unfurled like pale petals opening to an unseen sun, but her face remained locked, jaw frozen wide as though mid-scream. When she rose, her breath reeked of spoiled cloth and mildew, and she would not speak, not to Dee, nor to anyone. She only pointed, over and over, to the vinegar basin in the chapel until they refilled it twice. Punchlines began to circulate in Hollow Glen like a secret currency, traded in nervous whispers. Not all who come back should. Or, some graves stay empty because the ground knows better. People repeated these lines not because they were funny, but because saying them aloud felt like tapping on a door to see whether something waited on the other side. As the months passed, changes settled over the valley like frost, creeping and quiet, transforming Hollow Glen from a community into an organism pulsing with a single, uneasy heartbeat. Houses lost their mirrors, as though the people feared seeing something reflected that was not entirely themselves. Buckets of water were boiled and set beside doorways, said to catch memory so it could not slip loose and roam the rooms unseen. No one sang, not even to soothe crying infants. Instead, families whispered psalms into vinegar jars, sealing them with wax and hiding them beneath floorboards, convinced that if words were allowed to float freely, they might summon the wrong kind of attention. And beneath these rituals lay a current of fear, sharpened into vigilance. Livestock were slaughtered rarely, and when they were, tongues were removed first and buried near the steps of the vine cellar, a precaution no one could fully explain, but everyone obeyed. Even animals seemed caught in the web of the valley's tension. Dogs no longer barked at passing strangers. Goats stared into corners of barns with eyes gone glassy, as though watching something humans could not see. A single punchline began to echo across taverns and whispered conversations. Even vinegar has ears. Some folk in Hollow Glen began visiting an apothecary who once brewed tonics in town but had now devoted himself to crafting strange tinctures he called soul binders. These were mixtures of vinegar steeped with roots, chalk dust, and filings shaved from the old church bell. People paid for these vials with relics: baby teeth, fragments of hymnals, small stones carried from graveyards. They said the soul binders dulled grief, quieted the whispering that sometimes curled around the edges of their thoughts. But others took too much and began speaking in voices not their own, voices that seemed borrowed from some older, slower time, as though memory itself had risen to answer questions no one had asked. Outside Hollow Glen, hunters began abandoning cabins deeper in the woods. Old family plots stood unvisited. Roads that once led to the county line curved back toward the valley instead, as if compelled by an invisible hand. Even those who never joined Reverend Yates's congregation kept vinegar jars near their hearths and salted their porches as a silent precaution, as though afraid that simply living so close to the temple might draw the attention of whatever watched from beneath the cellar stones. And then there was the magistrate, Elam Rusk, who sent 2 men to survey the chapel grounds. Neither returned. Days later, their horses arrived back in town riderless, eyes rolling, hooves split and cracked as if they'd been driven for days without rest. In the saddlebags, folded pages were found, torn from family Bibles, each marked with a different passage underlined in heavy strokes. One spoke of Ezekiel's vision, another of Lazarus, a third warned of the bitter cup. There was no explanation, only the unsettling sense that some invisible pattern was being stitched together from scripture and secrecy alike. When Reverend Yates was told of it, he merely smiled, the corners of his mouth pale and thin, and said, "Even vinegar needs time to steep." That line rippled outward like mildew spreading across stone, slow, quiet, and permanent, and left Hollow Glen steeped in an uncertainty thick enough to choke on. Because by then, the valley itself had begun to feel less like a place and more like a mind. And as each day bled into the next, the people of Hollow Glen began to realize a truth too monstrous to say aloud. They were no longer living in their town. They were living inside something that might be alive, and it was listening. By the turning of the year into 1849, the pulse of Hollow Glen had shifted from the steady rhythm of a living town into something more like the shallow breaths of a patient caught between life and death. The Vine Cellar, once intended as a place for a brief vigil over the dead, had become an archive of the in-between. Families brought their departed not to mourn, but to watch, to wait, to hope for the soft rustle of linen, the flicker of eyelids, the faintest breath leaking through lips pale as ash. At first, such returns were spoken of in reverent tones, offered as proof that faith, or at least vinegar, might bend the finality of death. But soon it became clear that not all who returned were as they had been, and in those days, the certainty of life's boundaries began to dissolve like salt in water. People whispered about bodies that moved before their eyes but did not blink, about voices that spoke, but with borrowed words, phrases too ancient for any living tongue. The air in Hollow Glen grew thick with the smell of vinegar and old mildew, a smell that wrapped itself around the rafters of homes and seeped into the grain of every wooden door. No wind could carry it away. And as the cellar grew more crowded, the people of Hollow Glen felt the walls of their world contract around them, as if the valley itself were folding inward, becoming a place whose borders no longer touched the world beyond. One man, An apothecary once known for making cordial syrups and cough tonics had begun to craft something else entirely. He called them soul binders, tinctures of vinegar steeped with roots, chalk dust, and filings scraped from the bell of an abandoned chapel. People queued to buy them, bartering relics like baby teeth, bits of hymnals, or tiny stones taken from graveyards. They said these drafts dulled the grief that slithered through Hollow Glen like a cold snake. But those who drank too deeply sometimes found their voices changed, emerging in slow, alien cadences, as though memory itself had risen to speak through them. And still, the punchlines spread like mold on wet cedar in Hollow Glen. Even silence has echoes, or don't drink what remembers you. These phrases took root in conversations, repeated with nervous smiles that vanished the moment eyes shifted away. Outside the town, hunters abandoned their cabins deep in the woods. Old family plots were left untended. Roads that once led outward now curved back toward the valley as though turned by invisible hands. Even those who never stepped foot in the temple kept vinegar jars at their hearths, salted their porches, and avoided whistling after dark. Because in Hollow Glen, sound was no longer merely sound, it was bait, and the valley seemed always listening. Magistrate Elam Rusk, a man known for his broad shoulders and iron stare, sent 2 of his men to investigate the temple. Neither returned. Days later, their horses staggered back into town, eyes rolling white, flanks streaked with sweat, hooves split and bleeding as if they'd been driven over stone for days without rest. The saddlebags contained only folded pages, torn from different family Bibles, each passage marked with trembling underlines. Ezekiel's vision of wheels within wheels. Lazarus called from the tomb. A single phrase about the bitter cup. No 2 passages matched. When Reverend Yates was told of the discovery, he only smiled, the lines at the corners of his mouth etched deep as knife cuts, and said, "Even vinegar needs time to steep." It was the same line that had become the valley's quiet refrain. A phrase that seemed mild but stuck in the mind like a splinter. And beneath its softness lay the sense that Hollow Glen was waiting for something none of them could name. The unease grew with each passing night, as though the fabric of the town had grown too thin to keep the darkness from pressing through. People stopped calling each other by name, choosing instead titles that shifted like shadows: Morning Mouth, Third Watcher, Keeper of the Drain. They claimed names were bait, too, that speaking a name might summon something that knew how to answer. Punchlines now came sharper, tinged with panic rather than humor. Names are the first thing vinegar forgets, or only the quiet get to leave. The physical world seemed to warp around them. Roads that had run straight for generations bent inward toward the temple. Doors hung slightly askew, as though the buildings were leaning toward some unseen gravity. Animals grew silent. Dogs no longer barked. Hens laid eggs with shells so thin they collapsed under a breath. Even the crows stopped gathering in the trees above the vine cellar, choosing instead to wheel in silent spirals high above, never daring to land. The people of Hollow Glen began to move through their lives like actors in a play for which no script existed, performing gestures they barely understood, whispering into jars, pouring vinegar over thresholds, refusing to sleep with their faces turned toward the temple. And yet, every one of them felt it, that tightening coil of inevitability, the knowledge that something was coming through. And no matter how many rituals they performed, how many jugs they left uncorked on doorsteps, it might not be enough to keep it out. Or perhaps worse, it might already be inside. And with each new body laid in the vine cellar, with each new return that seemed less human than the last, the people of Hollow Glen began to grasp a truth colder than the deepest well. They were not only living in the valley. They were living inside something that was alive, something that listened, that remembered, and that was growing hungry. The valley was no longer a place. It was becoming a mouth. And every whispered prayer, every sealed jar, every silence was just one more offering to keep its teeth from closing. In Hollow Glen, no one asked anymore what Reverend Yates had meant when he said the valley had called him. Because deep down, they all felt it now. The valley was calling them, too. By late winter of 1849, Hollow Glen had become a place where normal time ceased to exist. The boundaries that once separated dawn from dusk, dream from waking, the living from the dead, were dissolving like salt in rain. And though snow blanketed the valley in drifts as high as a man's waist, the people of Hollow Glen found no comfort in its hush. For beneath the crust of ice, something moved, a rhythmic knocking from the vine cellar floor that pulsed like a second heartbeat beneath the town's own. At first, the sound was faint, like wood swelling against stone. But soon, it gathered force, echoing through the chapel rafters until it seemed the temple of the vine itself was breathing. Those who tended the bodies below claimed the cadence matched the rhythm of Yeats's whispered sermons. Others insisted it mimicked a pulse, something alive yet unseen, laboring beneath the earth to be born. And as the sound deepened, so did the feeling that Hollow Glen was not simply a place where strange things happened, but the very engine of those happenings, the mouth through which they spoke into the world. One night, beneath the burden of this growing dread, Reverend Yeats fasted for 3 days. He drank nothing but vinegar steeped with rose hip and ash, and lay prone upon the cellar floor, as if listening to secrets buried in stone. On the 3rd night, he rose, eyes rimmed in red, lips cracked and bleeding, and said only, "The soil remembers. It has tasted enough sweetness. Now it wants the bitter." From that moment, a new rite was introduced, the binding cup. A shared draught, thick and dark as ink, passed mouth to mouth in utter silence. Those who drank claimed to dream of corridors with no corners, of voices speaking behind their eyes, of footsteps echoing upward from below. Some awoke with dried vinegar crusting the corners of their lips, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if gazing upon some truth too large to fit inside human sight. And though no one confessed it openly, the fear bloomed like mold that each sip bound them to the valley, tied their memories to the thing moving beneath the cellar floor. Punchlines continued to slip like knives between ribs. "Don't swallow what can swallow you." Or, "Memory is meat, and the valley is hungry." They were spoken with nervous laughter that never reached the eyes, leaving the taste of vinegar behind each word. Outside, the town grew still. The town grew. Livestock stood motionless in the fields, breath steaming into the frost, eyes rolling white as though tracking unseen shapes among the trees. Dogs sat at thresholds, staring east toward the chapel, silent and trembling, as though caught between loyalty and terror. And then, as spring tried to press its way into the valley, something worse arrived, the unbirth. Pregnancies that once swelled under corseted dresses now vanished overnight, leaving women hollow-eyed, clutching their bellies. Speaking of dreams, where cold hands reached into their flesh and took something unseen. Midwives whispered of wombs that felt empty where once life had stirred. A woman named Mercy Dolan claimed she awoke to find her child missing not from her arms, but from inside her, as if erased from the ledger of existence. In Hollow Glen, people began to fear that the returns of the dead were not gifts but trades. That for every soul coaxed back across the bitter threshold, something young, something innocent, was demanded in exchange. On the chapel wall, a new phrase appeared, painted in dark brine. "That which is unborn may still be remembered." No one saw who wrote it. No one dared wash it away. And when it faded, it left behind no stain, only a lingering scent of rot and rosemary that clung to the wood for weeks. Travelers began to avoid the valley altogether, saying their compasses lagged and their watches slowed the nearer they came to Hollow Glen. Letters sent to the town returned unopened. Ink bloomed into unreadable shapes, as though the words themselves had soured. And those few who entered on foot described the air as too heavy, the sky as dimmer, as though the valley were sinking beneath some invisible tide. The punchlines took on a new edge of despair. "The mouth does not close until it's fed." Or, "Sweetness hides the teeth." By now, the congregation had stopped gathering only at dusk. They began sleeping in shifts, some beneath the pews, others in the orchard, whispering into jars or tracing unseen shapes into the earth. Children were no longer seen during the day. Their laughter, once a faint echo along the creek or behind barns, was replaced by the clinking of jars in the dark. A woman named June Halva, who had resisted the binding cup for nearly 2 years, was found standing in the basin at dawn. Eyes rolled back, mouth shaping names no one recognized. Her body was cold, but her mouth remained warm. The vinegar had not preserved her, it had claimed her. Afterward, her house burned itself to the foundation without spark or storm. Her neighbors said nothing, only left 2 jugs on the ashes, each uncorked, each filled with air that smelled of peaches long rotted. A hush fell over Hollow Glen, not from fear but from expectation, the kind of silence that comes before thunder. No dogs barked. No roosters crowed. And when the wind did come, it carried not dust nor seed, but the sharp tang of vinegar, so thick it stung the eyes and coated the tongue. The living moved slower, as though weighed down by an invisible chain. Even the old men who gathered at the crossroads post stopped their card games, sitting instead in rigid silence, hands folded, backs too straight, eyes fixed east toward the chapel. Inside the vine cellar, the arrangement of the bodies changed. Those who had once lain in neat rows were now propped along the walls, upright, cloaked in soaked linen like statues caught mid-procession. No one admitted to moving them. No one questioned why. In the center, beneath the memory vat, someone placed a wooden cradle. It was too small for any of the dead, and it held no child, only a single blackened tooth, wrapped in red wool. When asked about it, Reverend Yates simply said, "The mouth does not close until it's fed." And in Hollow Glen, every soul began to wonder whether the mouth was the valley, or the basin, or the memory still breathing behind their own eyes. When the first thaw came to Hollow Glen, it did not bring renewal. The snow melted not into streams of silver, but into a thin brine that smelled of vinegar and old blood, seeping into the soil until the earth itself felt slick underfoot, as though it could not decide whether to hold weight or swallow it whole. It was then that the true shape of the valley began to emerge, not merely as a place, but as an intention, as though for decades, perhaps centuries, something had been coiling beneath the roots and rocks, waiting for a fracture through which it might speak. And Hollow Glen, it seemed, was that fracture. It began with the floorboards of the vine cellar warping in soft undulations, as if a tide were rolling just beneath the chapel's foundation. Those tending the dead whispered of a new sound rising from below, a slow, metered drip that struck stone like a pulse, each drop thick, sour, tinged with iron. The substance gathered in glass vials placed beneath the beams, and though no one named it outright, the old schoolmaster, whose hair had gone to silver and whose eyes were now pale as milk, said only, "It's remembrance, steeped." His voice was thin as paper, and he spoke only in the past tense, as if he no longer participated in the present. That same week, the children returned. No one saw where they emerged from. They arrived barefoot through the orchard at dawn, hair wet as though from deep water, clothes drained of all color, eyes dark and vacant as if stuffed with shadow. Their parents did not run to embrace them. Instead, they simply nodded, as though acknowledging something inevitable. Each child carried an offering: buttons, thimbles, scraps of parchment folded into squares so tight they seemed like tiny seeds. These offerings were laid at the foot of the elderwood frame that stood now behind the basin, its copper bindings spread like veins, pulsing faintly as though it drew breath. And when the figure behind the threshold stepped forward, closer than she'd ever come before, the room seemed to shrink around her presence. Her veil was soaked and glistening as if she'd walked through rain that existed only for her. Beneath it, her face was smooth, featureless, save for faint depressions where eyes might have been. And in her arms, she carried something that shifted and breathed, a shape neither wholly human nor wholly other. The congregation fell to their knees without a word, as though compelled by instinct older than memory. A low hum filled the air, not melody, but vibration, like the buzzing of insects inside walls. And in that moment, certainty cracked. A man who'd once scoffed at Reverend Yates as a charlatan rose trembling to his feet, crying out, "This is no house of God. This is the hinge on which the door of the world swings open." His voice broke, and he collapsed, sobbing into his own hands. Punchlines ceased to be jokes. They became prophecies. The vinegar is not for the body, it's for what wears it. Or, nothing sweet survives the mouth. People began to question whether their memories were truly theirs. Dreams bled into daylight, leaving villagers frozen mid-task, staring into the distance as though listening to a voice no one else could hear. A woman was found kneeling in the orchard, humming a hymn no one recognized, her fingertips worn bloody from scratching cymbals into the frost. When spoken to, she replied in perfect Latin, though she had never learned a word of it. Rumors swelled like a rising tide. Some claimed the figure behind the elderwood frame was the valley itself made flesh. Others whispered she was the distilled sorrow of every life Hollow Glen had ever claimed. And the object she carried, that bundle that pulsed in her arms, was said to be neither child nor creature, but a memory so potent it had gathered weight and breath, seeking form to walk the world. Even the elders who once insisted there was an explanation for everything fell silent. For in Hollow Glen, reason was no longer protection. It was bait. The valley seemed alive with possibility, each breeze carrying the tang of vinegar and something older, an aftertaste of stone, root, and marrow. Letters sent from Hollow Glen no longer arrived intact. The few that slipped past the valley's invisible border arrived with their ink curdled into spirals, words twisted into shapes that made no sense unless read backward. And even then, only half sense emerged. Memory has mass. The mouth remembers what the tongue forgets. Some read these letters and wept. Others burned them without ever opening the seals, terrified of what might crawl out between the folds of the paper. Travelers spoke of approaching the valley's edge and feeling time slow, watches freezing on impossible hours, compass needles spinning wildly. And even those who turned away swore they smelled vinegar in the wind for days afterward, as if Hollow Glen's breath clung to them, a reminder that no road ever truly led away. Within the chapel, the basin grew wider without anyone recalling who carved it. The elderwood frame stood taller, its copper veins creeping outward along the floorboards, like roots searching for purchase. And behind the threshold, the figure waited, veil trembling, as though she was listening to names being spoken that had not yet been given. And though Reverend Yates still sat beside the basin, his skin had turned the pale color of parchment, and his movements had become less human gesture than the memory of gesture, as though his body were remembering how to move even as his soul withdrew. One final punchline lingered on every tongue. The valley does not want the dead. It wants the living to remember how to die. And in Hollow Glen, faith began to shatter under the weight of realization that the true terror was not that the dead could return, but that everything they believed about life, death, and the soul was merely brine in a basin waiting to be poured. And as spring unfurled across the mountains, Hollow Glen knew one truth: their valley was no longer simply a place. It was the vessel for something hungry enough to swallow memory, and cunning enough to let them believe it was salvation. As spring pressed its wet fingers deeper into the bones of Hollow Glen, the valley seemed to tighten around itself like a snake coiling to swallow. A hush hung over the town, not from relief, but from the sense that every breath drawn might be one breath too many. And it was then, beneath a sky pale as bruised milk, that the final revelations began to bloom. The memory vat, which had once been merely a basin of vinegar, now stood swollen and dark as a wound. It no longer reflected lantern light. Instead, it seemed to drink it in, leaving the surface flat, lightless, a pane of darkness as impenetrable as obsidian. Those who dared stand close swore they saw shapes swirling beneath, pale and jointless, like bone turned to fluid. One boy, Milton Gress, claimed he remembered being born not from a mother but from that very vat. He said the first scent he knew was vinegar and wood. His family locked him in the loft that night. By morning, he was gone, leaving behind only a trail of wet footprints leading toward the orchard. Each print resting on the soil as though whoever made them was too light to belong fully to the world. The river ran backward for 6 hours that same day. Fish floated belly up, mouths agape. All turned toward the temple as though listening for instruction. There was no stench of rot. The fish remained pristine, perfect, but utterly lifeless, like offerings waiting to be claimed. And above it all, the sky held itself still, a gray so dense it felt like an iron lid pressing the valley down. The pulpit was removed from the temple without explanation. In its place rose a tall frame of elderwood bound with blackened copper wire, something between a doorway and a scaffold. It vibrated with a low hum, as though tuned to a frequency only fear could hear. Reverend Yates stood beside it at every gathering, his palm resting against the wood as if to steady himself or perhaps to listen. He no longer preached. Instead, the congregation read aloud from slips of vellum drawn from vinegar-filled jars, each slip etched with lines written in a hand none recognized. The longer they read, the weaker their voices grew, until some collapsed before finishing. One boy coughed blood into the vat and smiled as though relieved. And each time someone faltered, the frame shimmered, and the air around it bent, rippling like heat above stone. Punchlines turned sharp, lethal, no longer jokes but incantations. The valley doesn't forgive, it ferments. Or, memory is just flesh steeped too long. Then, on a night when the clouds hung so low they seemed to brush the chapel roof, the shadow of a woman appeared on the far side of the frame. She stood tall, veiled, holding something wrapped in cloth that shifted as though breathing. A man reached toward her. His hand blistered instantly, skin puckering into the shape of a pear. He never slept again, his eyes wide open until the day they found him wandering the orchard, whispering. She's learning the names. The figure behind the veil stepped closer in the nights that followed. The veil grew thinner, revealing glimpses of movement underneath a flicker of features that did not stay still, as though several faces were trying to wear the same skin all at once. Her arms were long, ending in fingers split at the ends, each tipped with tiny copper buds that shivered whenever anyone spoke a name. It was said these buds tracked motion, turning slowly to follow the breath of whoever passed. She never spoke, but she listened, and her silence broke something fundamental inside those who met her gaze. Some villagers began speaking backward in their sleep. Children woke screaming about rooms with no corners and hallways dripping brine. A woman tried to gouge out her tongue, crying that it was whispering secrets the valley wanted kept. The elders, who once insisted the rituals were mere superstition, now sat in silence, eyes cast down, refusing even to cross themselves. Because by now, Hollow Glen understood that the valley was no longer simply collecting bodies. It was collecting memory itself, feeding on it, shaping it into something that could cross over into the waking world. The glass fruits grew in clusters on the orchard trees, vessels shaped like jugs, filled halfway with pale vinegar, and fragments of paper on which words bled upward, as though written from below. Children harvested them with linen gloves soaked in ash. They carried the jugs into the chapel and placed them around the memory vat in a perfect circle, as though forming eyes watching whatever lay in its depths. Over time, the air shifted. It no longer smelled only of vinegar and mold, but of parchment, of breath, of paper left too long in damp cellars. Some swore they could hear entire conversations whispering from the vats, recounting moments no one could remember living. And behind it all, the frame hummed, louder now, as though preparing to speak its own language. Punchlines became warnings whispered into the dark. What's unborn remembers. And it's listening. Or, the valley will teach you how to leave your skin behind. In the final days before planting season, the congregation gathered barefoot in the fields, where strange shoots had begun to rise pale green but sharp-tipped, unmoving even in the wind. Reverend Yates poured vinegar over the soil and whispered, "What returns is not what was lost, but it knows your name." That night, 13 jugs appeared on the chapel steps, each bearing a name carved into the dried skin of fruit, stitched over the mouth. When the wind blew, the jugs rattled with a sound like teeth. By dawn, they were gone. In their place stood 13 pairs of boots, empty but still warm, all facing east toward the frame. And in Hollow Glen, no one pretended anymore that what they worshipped was salvation, because the true horror was no longer the possibility of death. It was that their memories, their truths, their very names, were ingredients steeped in the vat, waiting to become something else, something. And as the veil fluttered and the figure behind the frame stepped closer, they understood the worst truth of all. The valley wasn't possessed. The valley was alive, and it was hungry. By the cusp of planting season, Hollow Glen no longer felt like a town, but like a body caught mid-breath, trembling on the verge of a final exhalation. A hush lay over the valley so profound it seemed to warp the air itself, bending sound, folding time. Even sunlight felt reluctant to spill between the cedar trunks, as if aware that its warmth was unwelcome here. And in this gathering darkness, the final revelations began to bloom like rot bursting through the skin of overripe fruit. The elderwood frame at the heart of the temple had grown monstrous in silence. No longer merely a structure, it seemed to exhale its own atmosphere, humid and sharp with brine. Copper wires crawled like veins from its joints into the floorboards, leaving the wood beneath greenish and damp. And behind it, the figure lingered, her veil now so thin that the features beneath writhed and shifted, never staying true for more than an instant. At times, she appeared childlike. Other times, her silhouette stretched taller than any mortal frame, limbs elongated, fingers split into fractal branches that twitched as though sniffing the air. The thing she carried, the pulsing bundle, no longer lay still. It twisted and jerked as though wrestling an unseen tether, exhaling soft clicks that fell between syllables of human language without quite becoming words. It was during one gathering that the figure finally stepped forward, pushing her arms through the frame. The copper buds on her fingertips glowed faintly, and the cloth around the bundle sloughed away to reveal a mass, neither flesh nor mineral, something pale, translucent, slick as wet glass. Within it shimmered shadows of people's faces, mouths opening and closing in silent scream. Reverend Yates, once a man of flesh, now stood beside the vat as though a figure carved from bleached parchment, his skin thin enough to show the rivers of pale veins beneath. His voice had gone to a whisper so soft it felt like breath on glass. "The mouth wants what remembers," he said. "It cannot eat what forgets." And the congregation, already splintered between terror and worship, collapsed to their knees. Punchlines lost all humor. They became funeral bells. Nothing sweet survives the mouth, or the price of remembering is losing who remembers. Those who dared look deeper into the shifting mass behind the veil began speaking of things they should not know. Names of herbs in extinct languages. Lines of scripture no known Bible had ever printed. Secrets hidden in the folds of local family histories now uttered in perfect detail. A man named Ephraim Lockhack, who arrived searching for his kin, was found muttering, "I saw my own birth in the vat, and the face that lifted me out was not my mother's." He wept blood for 3 days before vanishing, leaving behind his boots, still warm. Toes pointed toward the orchard. Outside, the orchard bore no blossoms, only glass fruits drooping from the trees, heavy and slick. Inside, each glimmered fragments of paper on which words had begun bleeding upward, twisting into new languages whose letters curled like small, living things. Children were sent to harvest these fruits, their linen gloves soaked in ash and rainwater. They carried the vessels into the chapel and arranged them in circles around the memory vat, as though forming rings of eyes watching whatever lurked beneath its black surface. From the depths of the vat came not merely scent, but voice-fragmented conversations. Fragments of confessions never spoken aloud. Pleas for forgiveness offered in trembling whispers. A woman named Cassie Halt, mute since birth, was seen standing at the rim of the vat, mouthing words she could not possibly speak. From her lips spilled a thin, cloudy stream of liquid that hissed as it touched the surface. And then, around her feet, Pale vines began to grow, unfurling toward the elderwood frame, as though the earth itself were answering her call. The punchlines returned as warnings choked in terror. What's unborn remembers. Or some truths ferment until they're strong enough to breathe. And behind it all, the figure in the frame stepped closer still. The veil lifted just enough to reveal a mouth stretching impossibly wide, a black cavern lined not with teeth, but with pale, pulsing vines that seemed to taste the air, quivering in anticipation. A single eye flickered open, and it was not human. It was the same color as vinegar poured over iron, a shade somewhere between rust and memory. The congregation froze, time bent, and in the hush that followed, the figure finally spoke. The voice was not Yates's, nor any voice known in Hollow Glen. It was layered, dozens speaking at once, each syllable shaped from breath and brine. What you fear is not death. What you fear is remembering. The words cut through marrow. Women dropped their lanterns. Men clutched their heads, sobbing. It was as though the walls of the temple dissolved, revealing corridors behind corridors, stairways plunging into darkness. And the sense that the temple was not a building at all but the throat of something vaster, swallowing everything it touched. Outside, the wind carried a new scent sweet for an instant, then sour as bile. Birds fell silent. Even insects fled the orchard. And beneath the dirt, the knocking grew louder, faster, like something hammering to be born. No one spoke of salvation now. There was only the certainty that Hollow Glen's purpose had never been to save the living or resurrect the dead. It had always been a crucible for memory, a place where every forgotten truth was steeped, fermented, and prepared to return in new and monstrous form. And as the elderwood frame shimmered and cracked, and the figure behind it leaned forward, the valley learned its most chilling punchline yet: the dead don't haunt the living. The living haunt the memory of the dead. And in Hollow Glen, every soul felt the borders of their mind fray under the weight of a single truth: the valley was not a place they inhabited. It was a mind that had been inhabiting them all along. When the final frost retreated from Hollow Glen, it left behind no gentle thaw, no budding of flowers, no birdsong. Instead, a residue clung to every blade of grass, a pale film like wax that shimmered in the weak sun, yet left a greasy stain on the fingers of anyone who dared touch it. Beneath it, the earth remained cold, as though the valley refused to allow warmth back into its marrow. And though the skies lightened, the air stayed heavy, filled with a hush so profound it seemed to press on the chest, each breath drawn with effort, like inhaling through cloth soaked in vinegar. Those who remained in Hollow Glen did so not out of loyalty, but out of a numbed inability to imagine the world beyond its borders. The roads no longer led away in any way the mind could follow. Maps showed roads, yes, but they twisted back upon themselves. Roots that once traced clean lines now curled like roots seeking dark water. Even the river, when it flowed, seemed to pull toward the temple, as though the water itself obeyed a memory older than stone. People spoke less, and when they did, their voices carried an echo, as if layered over whispers that were not their own. Names faded first, then faces. In Hollow Glen, it became common to greet a neighbor with only a nod, for fear that calling them by name might summon the valley's attention. Punchlines lingered, sour as old fruit. The valley doesn't take you. It waits until you give yourself. Or, what lives beneath remembers longer than we do. The elderwood frame at the front of the temple remained, but it had begun to warp, its copper veins branching outward across the floorboards in delicate fractals that looked like frost, but felt hot to the touch. Behind it, the figure still hovered, veil soaked in a moisture that dripped steadily onto the wood below. Each droplet hissed as it struck the floor, leaving tiny burn marks shaped like seeds. And from her chest now grew thin, black vines tipped in copper, which twisted slowly as if sniffing the air for secrets. The memory vat had transformed utterly. Once filled with vinegar, It now held a substance dark as ink and thick as syrup, which refused to reflect light. People said that if you stared into it too long, it would stare back, showing you not just your memories, but moments you had never lived, births and deaths from centuries past. Glimpses of strangers' faces twisted in silent terror, corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. One woman screamed that she'd seen her own funeral performed by people wearing her face. Another whispered that the vat had revealed to her that no one in Hallowed Glen had ever truly been born, only steeped. The air smelled not only of vinegar but of iron, damp parchment, and something sweeter that curled in the nostrils before turning sour as bile. Children no longer played in the streets. Instead, they moved in pairs, wrists bound together by twine soaked in vinegar, eyes cast downward, whispering numbers as though counting steps in a ritual dance. Even laughter had been replaced by a soft, rhythmic hum, a sound that seemed to pulse from the very bones of the town. The orchard, once filled with sweet apples and pears, bore only glass fruits, now transparent vessels filled with pale liquid that shifted and shimmered as though alive. And though no wind touched their branches, the glass fruits sometimes rang faintly, a chime so high it could barely be heard, as if the valley itself were testing the edges of human hearing. Those who harvested the fruits did so in silence, carrying each vessel into the temple and arranging them in precise patterns around the vat. Some claimed the glass fruits whispered to them, recounting secrets or reciting old prayers in voices that were half human, half something else. Punchlines turned bitter, stained with dread. Memory is just vinegar waiting for a mouth. Or, the valley won't kill you. It will let you remember forever. Houses began to lean subtly inward toward the temple, windows reflecting not the street outside but the orchard, even when facing the wrong direction. Doors swelled in their frames, refusing to close fully, as though the wood itself rejected the notion of shutting out whatever prowled beyond. Animals refused to give milk. Hens laid eggs with yolks black as ink, and dogs sat trembling, eyes fixed on the elder wood frame as if waiting for a signal only they could hear. Some nights, the bell buried upright in the orchard rang without human hand, a deep, dull note like a throat closing over words left unsaid. Reverend Yates remained by the vat, his body grown translucent, veins visible like threads of mold in glass. He spoke no more sermons, only soft phrases whispered into the vat's surface, his breath stirring ripples that rolled outward like gentle waves on a poisoned sea. The final punchline settled across Hallowed Glen like a shroud. This was never our town. We were always living inside it. And in that hush, the people began to understand that the true horror was not that the valley could steal life or restore the dead. The true horror was that Hallowed Glen was not a place at all but a memory, alive and aware, steeping every soul it touched. And though the figure behind the veil had not yet stepped fully through the frame, they all knew, with a certainty deeper than blood, that she would. And when she did, there would be no difference between memory and flesh, no difference between the valley and themselves, because in Hallowed Glen, the past was never gone. It was only waiting to be remembered and remembered until it could walk. By the first days of June, Hallowed Glen no longer obeyed the rules of the world beyond its ridgelines. The sky remained locked in a dim perpetual twilight, a dull canvas through which neither sun nor stars could pierce. The air hung thick and moist, like the breath of some unseen beast exhaling from beneath the soil. Crops ceased to try. Soil turned sour. Trees bore not leaves but soft translucent sacs that sagged with moisture, and burst with a smell no one dared describe aloud. Those who still called themselves congregants no longer moved alone but in pairs, bound wrist to wrist by twine soaked in vinegar. Each pair made silent circuits around the vine cellar at dusk, their steps measured, their eyes scanning for movement no one else could see. No one spoke during these watches, for it was said that words spilled carelessly in the waning light were heard too clearly beneath the floorboards, and that whatever listened there had begun answering back not in sound, but in memory. The memory vat required constant tending. Its edges hardened each morning, flaking like old parchment, while the center remained soft, warm, pulsing gently as though stirred from below. It consumed more each day: old hymnals, baptismal records, bundles of hair wrapped in linen, even the benches once used for prayer. Nothing floated. Nothing returned. It was said that a name whispered against the rim of the vat would vanish not only from paper but from recollection alike. And the price of such forgetting was not grief, it was hunger. For once forgotten, the soul demanded replacement. And so, they began writing new names on slips of salted vellum: Mercy Wythe, Juneth the Younger. Mouth bitterkin names that belonged to no one, yet were offered up to fill the void. The elderwood frame, once simply a portal, had begun to bloom a second shape beside it, a slimmer frame bound in blackened copper, shimmering faintly, as though sweating a cold brine. Behind this new threshold glimmered water deep and dark as oil, shifting with the suggestion of something vast moving just beyond sight. Congregants began preparing for the exchange. They did not speak of it openly, but in the arrangement of jugs, in the hush of their prayers, it was understood something was coming through, and something would be given in return. The punchlines shifted from warnings to resignation. We're only borrowed shapes, or the valley needs new tongues to speak old memories. And at night, villagers found themselves waking in cold sweat, teeth aching, as though biting down on secrets too sharp to hold. The orchard bore more glass fruits than ever before. Each ripened overnight into vessels shaped like jugs, filled with pale vinegar and tiny scraps of paper on which words twisted into spirals. No one opened these jugs. Instead, children were taught to weigh them by hand, to listen for the slosh of memory within, to catalog them by tone and density rather than sight. They were stored in the root cellar beneath the chapel, now renamed the First Belly. Those who ventured into it spoke of a pressure behind the eyes, a scent like old pages steeped in brine, and the sensation of something beneath the ground listening to their breath. Punchlines became truths too bitter to swallow. The dead aren't gone. They're steeping, or memory's the only thing that can come back. And then, one night without any summons, a procession began. The townsfolk rose in the dark, moving as if pulled by invisible threads. Each carried bundles of cloth tied with human hair. Inside the cloths were teeth, some small like baby teeth, others large enough to belong to creatures not quite human. They laid these offerings before the elderwood frame, which now arched forward as if leaning into the room. The veiled figure behind the threshold had ceased pacing. She stood rigid, head bowed, arms crossed over her chest. Her shape had broadened, sharpened at the joints, taller by inches. When a child approached the frame and knelt, the figure raised her head for the first time. Beneath the veil there was no face, only a smear of pale color, a swirl of features that refused to settle into anything recognizably human. The child reached out and began to hum. By dawn, the child was gone, leaving only a vine sprouting from the floor where they'd knelt, black as pitch, thick as rope, curling inward like a noose, exhaling a scent of salt and bile. The congregation named it the tongue. They tended it gently, whispering psalms into its coils, as if calming a living creature. Punchlines vanished. Only whispers remained, soft and quivering. We live inside a memory that wants to become flesh. Or, what returns is not what was lost, but it knows your name. Reverend Yates spoke no more. His hands, once clasped in prayer, moved constantly, tracing invisible symbols in the air, lifting and cupping nothing, as though feeling for currents only he could perceive. Some nights, the buried bell rang on its own, a deep, muffled toll like the sound of a throat closing over words that dared not escape. The memory vat had become something far removed from vinegar. Its surface absorbed light instead of reflecting it. When disturbed, it did not ripple. It swallowed. Once, a young man dropped a candle into its depths. He looked in after it and screamed without pause until others poured the old vinegar down his throat, silencing him in one last, hollow gasp. In the days that followed, Hollow Glen leaned further inward. Roofs sagged toward the chapel. Doors hung half open as if the wood itself feared being closed. Animals lay silent, refusing to look anyone in the eye. And still, the veiled figure waited, her veil fluttering as though stirred by a breath rising from far below. And the final truth dawned. Heavy as Stone Hollow Glen was never simply a town. It was a vessel for memory, steeping human lives into a new shape. And the congregation understood at last that the horror they faced was not merely death nor resurrection, but the knowledge that one day, every memory would find flesh enough to walk again, and that when it did, it would remember them all. As Hollow Glen staggered into what should have been summer, the valley itself seemed to sigh a long, low exhalation that rattled loose shingles and sent ripples through the glass fruits hanging from orchard boughs. But there was no warmth in the wind. It carried instead the tang of vinegar and the faint rust scent of old blood, drifting through streets where laughter had once lived. By then, the congregation no longer called themselves by names. Language itself had become a risk. They spoke in gestures, in patterns of placed objects. An overturned cup beside a door meant safe passage, while a length of twine looped 3 times around a chair leg meant do not enter. The punchlines still existed, but they were murmured now like prayers. Memory doesn't die. It molts. Or some truths don't fit inside a single life. The town's edges grew softer, as if Hollow Glen was dissolving into something less geographical and more metaphysical. Maps refused to hold its shape. Even seasoned surveyors found their compasses spinning in circles. Roads turned inward like intestines, folding the valley deeper into itself. And when strangers came seeking missing kin, they rarely found even the town's silhouette. It was as though the land had learned how to hide. The orchard had become a silent cathedral, glass fruits gleaming like lanterns even in daylight. Inside the fruit, shapes drifted, faces glimpsed in profile, mouths silently moving, eyes half open as if startled mid-prayer. Those who harvested the fruit reported hearing hymns from no visible source, verses winding around them like ribbons, each word sharp enough to cut. No one dared open the fruits anymore. They simply hung them in the chapel, forming shifting constellations around the memory vat. And the vat itself had grown monstrous. Its contents were no longer vinegar, but something black and thick, absorbing all light, refusing to ripple even when disturbed. Those who peered into its depths saw images they could not explain: endless corridors lined with wet stone, stairways spiraling downward into nothingness, the pale reflection of their own face twisted into masks they'd never worn. One woman wept for hours after claiming the vat showed her a child's face, calling her mother, though she'd never borne children. Another man insisted he saw the entire town floating inside the vat, tiny and perfect, like a model built to be studied, and that the figure behind the veil was observing it all. Punchlines had become cruel truths. The valley doesn't haunt you. It teaches you how to haunt yourself. Or memory is the only thing that can escape its own grave. Reverend Yates had ceased all human speech. He sat beside the vat, skin drawn taut over bones, his eyes blank as polished stone. His lips moved constantly, shaping words too soft to hear, yet the vat sometimes quivered as if responding. When he moved, it was less the motion of a man than the memory of motion, a kind of trembling echo of gestures he no longer fully possessed. The townsfolk watched him with an uneasy reverence, afraid to approach yet unable to look away. Some said Yates was no longer truly alive, but had become part of the vat itself, a vessel containing all he'd preached, steeped into something black and bitter. Outside, the orchard's vines crept slowly toward the chapel walls, leaving smears of brine along the wood. A child was seen dragging her own shadow behind her, the dark shape stretching several feet longer than her body, resisting as though reluctant to follow. She disappeared by dawn. In her place, a warm jug stood on the chapel steps, its glass cloudy, its contents moving as if breathing. The elders gathered around it but dared not touch. Punchlines flickered like dying stars. What's unborn remembers, or the vat feeds on the silence between words. The wind carried whispers that twisted into warnings no human tongue had uttered. Even the birds avoided the orchard now, wheeling wide circles as if repelled by an invisible fence. No dogs barked, no roosters crowed at sunrise. The valley had entered a hush so deep it seemed to erase the boundary between waking and dreaming. One by one, the town's clocks were dismantled, their gears dissolved in vinegar, their hands buried under orchard trees that bore no fruit anyone wished to taste. Time became irrelevant. The congregation moved according to rhythms they could not name, driven by pulses felt in marrow, rather than marked on any dial. The final punchline settled into every breath. Hollow Glen wasn't built on memory. Memory built Hollow Glen. And it was then the people realized the valley's most terrible truth. It was not merely a haunted place, nor even a mouth waiting to feed. It was an intelligence, a mind, a memory so ancient and vast that it required human beings to give it shape, speech, and story. Everything they'd thought they'd known about life, about death, about the sanctity of their own memories had become suspect. Because in Hollow Glen, nothing was truly theirs, not even their recollections. And in the silent hours before dawn, as the memory vat pulsed softly in the dark, the congregation held their breath and wondered if they would ever truly leave, or if they, too, would one day become part of the valley's endless, bitter remembering. So if tonight, long after midnight, you feel the hush pressing in around your windows, or hear a faint chime where there should be silence, remember this. Some places don't simply hold memories, they steep them, ferment them, until they spill over into flesh and voice and shadow. Hollow Glen was never a town you could point to on a map. It's an idea, a wound in reality, reminding us how thin the veil is between what we believe is real and what waits underneath. And perhaps that's the most chilling truth of all, that the darkness we fear might be listening, hungry not just for our lives, but for the stories we cling to so tightly. Yet here's your way out. Speak your story before it's swallowed. Let the memory belong to you, not the shadows. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Hollow Glen haunted you most? Save this video so you can revisit the chilling secrets you may have missed. And if you dare, subscribe. Because in places like Hollow Glen, the story never truly ends, it only waits to be remembered again.